Alright, so a lot of things going to be going on in this video, mostly me being confused, but also a dog barking next door that hopefully is gotten rid of by the microphone. But this video is going to be about last time I talked about Tier 3, and I ranked the 13th through 21st best player, or most successful tournament players in Triple Triad history. And I was looking at who should be in the next tier, and I kept coming back to a bunch of names whose achievements I thought lined up much better with Tier 3, that I had either not looked deeply into enough when considering who to be in Tier 3, or I hadn't realized could be in contention. And these names not only deserve to be in Tier 3, but I think they're all comfortably in Tier 3. And so there were 3 names that really jumped out, and then there were 2 more that seemed to me to be really, clearly at the head of the next tier, but I think not quite making Tier 3. And I sort of said, here are some baselines of net achievement, and those 2 players, each of them are close, but don't quite make it. And I'll get into that. And I'm also going to babble a bit about some stats stuff, so feel free to skip ahead in the video if I'm talking about something uninteresting. Of course, you might always feel free to do that, and that might, some would argue, mean you should skip the entire video, but I think stuff's interesting. So, I'd like to emphasize what I'm doing here is I am ranking success, not skill. And the other thing I wanted to talk about at the start was, if you have a 50% win rate in tournaments, does that make you an average player? And the answer is no. It makes you an above average player. In a round-robin format where you play everyone once, if you were 50%, you would be the average player. But Triple Triad tournaments were not played in a round-robin format. They were an elimination format. So I think one way to think about this, well, I have 3 ways to think about it, and 2 of them probably won't help you much. But the easiest way to think about it is... No, you know what? I'm going to say my 2 more complicated ways. So imagine a tournament that has chipmunks and humans. And every time a human plays a chipmunk, they always beat the chipmunk. And when a chipmunk plays another chipmunk, it's random which one wins. Every chipmunk is 0% against humans and 50% against other chipmunks. The humans always beat chipmunks and let's say are random against each other, 50% against each other. So you might think, okay, half the field is chipmunks, half the field is humans. So a human is going to win 75%. They'll beat other humans half the time. They'll beat chipmunks 100% of the time. Each are half the field, so it should be the midway point. Chipmunks are 0% against humans, 50% against other chipmunks, so that should average 25%. But this is not what's actually going to happen. And if we insert a cat, and let's say the cat always beats chipmunks and always loses to humans, will that cat win 50% of their games? No. In the first round, the cat has an equal chance to be paired with a chipmunk and to be paired with a human. So in the first round, it should win 50% of the time. In the second round, however, a lot of the chipmunks have been eliminated. Every time a chipmunk played a human advanced. Every time a human played a human advanced. Only when a chipmunk got paired with a chipmunk did a chipmunk advance. So in the second round, we're going to see a lot more humans than we see chipmunks. So the cat will, on average, in the second round face a human. In the third round, there's going to be even more humans and even fewer chipmunks. And by the 4th and 5th rounds, maybe we have no chipmunks left. So in the first round, the cat will be a true 50% win rate, but in later rounds, that rate's going to keep going down. And so if you won 50% of your games in tournaments, you were an above average player. You were doing better than the field, but it was a format where so many of the stronger players stay in for so much longer. So my second example, my second way to think about this is if you're the cat, what are your odds of playing a chip? And there's 1 chipmunk in the tournament and 1 seto. How likely are you to play the chipmunk? Well, you can only play the chipmunk if you get them in the first round. So if it's a 64-person tournament, you have a 1 out of 63 chance you're one of the competitors to play the chipmunk. But seto, you could see in the first round, you could see in the second round, you could see in the third round, the quarterfinals, the semifinals, the finals. So seto, you have much more opportunities to play during a tournament. And this is part of the reason why there are winners like Koner, who's clearly a great winner and an above average winner, who has a below 50% win rate against other winners, but it's because he's playing Seto a lot of those times and not playing the weaker end of winners as much, because Seto is so much more available to be played. He's in so many more rounds of the tournament. And so if someone is a true 50% win rate player, they are an above average player. And so when you see people's win rates and you see, okay, 60%, that doesn't seem that impressive, it's different than 60% in a league would be. And you should estimate it in a neutral setting where you are actually facing average opposition rather than what you really face, which is above average opposition, a few percentage better than that. And so one of the things I've done with win percentages is I've also done opposition adjustments that looks at who you actually played and how difficult they are. And we're going to see some of that. But it is to say, I think if you, at your peak in tournaments, say, we're running 50%, like you were making second round pretty regularly, sometimes going out first, sometimes going out third, that's a good player. Now, obviously, lots of good players didn't achieve that. You know, you could be a good player and have no tournament success at all. But it is to say, I think 50% win rate can feel bad for people who are used to winning at games, but is actually pretty good in this format. So then we have the short-term versus long-term problem of just how to consider someone who didn't do that much, right? Who played a short period of time. And I think Karmazin's an interesting case. So Karmazin played 2 tournaments. He made quarterfinals of the first, where he lost to Sujiro, who is my 12th best player of all time. And in his second tournament, he beat Kamikaze, among others, to win the tournament. So he only played those 2 tournaments. And this was the era of 7-round tournaments, not 6. So that actually means he went like, I think 12-1 or 11-1, while under later tournament durations, he might have only had to go like 8 or 9-1 or something to get a quarterfinal and a win. But I think he's 11 or 12-1. And so that's really impressive. And the question is, how much can you extrapolate from that, right? Do you say, he's 12-1, he's 92% win rate, so he should just be treated as if he'd have continued to be a 92% win rate over every other tournament. He'd have won half his tournaments. Everyone else is lucky he didn't play. Because he clearly would have crushed everyone, we can just assume he'd keep up his win rate. And I think this is wrong. But I think there's also the idea that, okay, he did those 2 really well, and we can't assume anything about the future. And that would, of course, be wrong too. But I think you can look at players who had similar starts and look at what their careers ended up being. So Unfixable, in his first tournament, was 1 round away from the quarterfinals, and the second tournament he was in, he won. And so Unfixable, you might think, is only 1 win off Karmazin, and basically played a few more tournaments, never did anything, and then stopped playing. Now, I would say it's a little farther away than it looks, just because I think Unfixable was at the very start and playing slightly shorter tournaments. It was that peak kind of 2005-6 period that the tournaments, or up to 2007 and into 2008, where tournaments were often 7 rounds, and at the very start and after 2008, they were basically 6 or less. And Karmazin was playing during that longer tournament time period. But Unfixable's record looks pretty similar, and it wasn't followed up by anything. Kaus is another example. He wins his first tournament. In his second tournament, though it was a short, weird tournament, he was 1 round away from the quarterfinals. So again, arguably just a win behind, though maybe more like 2 or 3 wins. Say 2 wins behind. But also won a tournament in his first 2, and was close to an icon in his second. And you can look at the rest of his career, and it's a really solid career. In the last video, I believe I ranked it 16th all time. And I ranked it ahead of Karmazin because I think he did some really impressive things, particularly in 2008 when he was the first player to win 4 icons, make 4 quarterfinals in a year. But he's another example of someone who starts similar to how Karmazin started, and then for a while did not have serious tournament success, and 5 years later had another really good run. Firebrand wins his first tournament and then has a round 1 exit in his second. And I think those are the only 2 tournaments he ever played. Broccoli wins her first tournament, has a round 1 exit in her second, does not have much tournament success for a while, goes away, comes back, immediately wins her first tournament back, and goes on to have a fair amount more success after that. And then we have other players who didn't necessarily win in their first 2, but won their third tournament. Virgil, Meta, and Suikoden, I always say Suikoden, but I believe it's supposed to be pronounced Suikoden, all won within their first 3 tournaments. They all had another result in their first 3 that was either a quarterfinals or like a round 4, or, some kind of fairly deep run. So they have kind of similar-ish starts. And Virgil has a few early exits after and then leaves. Suikoden plays on for a while, but never has any deep runs, or never, I don't think makes another icon after winning, maybe gets 1. Meta grabs another icon somewhere, but does not, maybe gets a finals a bit down the road. But the point is, a lot of players that start with a win early do not necessarily follow it up. If you look at this list, you see some people that we don't know, like Firebrand left. I don't have any more stats. I just can't judge. But you have people like Virgil, Meta, Suikoden, Unfixable, who, the rest of their resume, Meta's is pretty good. I ranked him 21st of all time. We're going to lower him slightly after this video, but spoilers. But it's really hard to judge. And Karmazin clearly has a better first two tournaments than all of these players except Doc Evil, who won both his first two. Like, Karmazin clearly has the second best start of any players there. But you also have to credit what people actually did. So I would say, of the other players here, Kaus Debonair clearly had the best career. Can you just give Karmazin, he's on pace a little ahead of Kaus, so we'll just say he had a better career. And I think given how much more Kaus achieved, I wasn't comfortable doing that, which is why I ranked Kaus ahead of Karmazin in the last video. But you can see where the problem is, because a start like this is really, really impressive. And as I said, Karmazin's start is better than everyone here but Doc. I just think a bunch of the people are close. And we know, if you watch Karmazin play trade or other things, really strong player. But how much credit can you give? So I think it's an interesting problem, and where you rank Karmazin is a really interesting question. And I was very comfortable putting him in tier 3, and I ended up feeling I had to put him behind people like Kaus Debonair, and your mileage on that may vary. But Kaus played the tournaments and did achieve significantly more, and I wanted to give that credit. But I just think it's an interesting problem. What do you do with someone who didn't play much and has a tremendous record during that short time? And it's unclear. And we have examples of people who had similar starts, and we can see what their careers looked like, and they tended to peak out at tier 3 players. So how did tier 3 work in the last video? And I sort of had this Kaus or Smokes Turds baseline that I talked about a bunch. I talked about how I thought those 3 players were really hard to separate. I think they have really similar strength careers. And they're all tournament winners. They all have lots of icons. I think all of them have at least 8. They have, I think, between 8 and 12 icons each, which is, a huge haul. They have very solid peak runs, too. They're not players. They're players who, in their, the year or two they were best, they put up a really good showing, and they kept achieving outside of that. So, okay, they're all tournament winners with 7+ icons. They all have a 60% overall win rate or higher. Kaus, I believe, is up at 66. Turds is at the bottom end at 60, 61. And they all have a peak 8 tournament run, where over an 8 tournament span, which is kind of like a 2-year tournament span in the more active period, or more 2.5 to 3 year span, they all put up at least a 71% performance. And again, 50% is above average. 71% is really good. If you're averaging a 75% performance, that's 3 and 1. That's like averaging an icon. This is a really, really good showing. Smokes was at the bottom of that peak run range. He was at like 71.5. I think Turds at 73.5 was the highest of those 3. But they're all pretty close. Similar amounts of icons. Smokes is the most. Similar peak runs. Turds has the most. Similar win rates. Kaus has the best win rate. Again, all very close. And if we look at the other people in tier 3, Cookie made it because I thought he had greater total achievement, right? He had the 2 tournament wins that put him ahead, and was also arguably in the greatest of all time conversation for a while, and is one of the few players who had a serious claim to being the best on the site for a real length of time. And basically everyone else who had a claim to I'm the best on the site for a serious duration of time, like, that was not just like I might be a little ahead, but like I am clearly the best. All of them I put in tier 1. And so Cookie on achievement looks ahead of this group. And in the other places, he looks similar. For a higher peak, we have Vid and Serenity. And Vid looked similar on achievement and also had a higher win rate, which is why Vid placed so high. Serenity had a lower win rate and lower achievement, but the peak was high enough that I ranked him up in this group. And then we have Karmazin and Dark Lord, who have higher win rates, but played much shorter amounts of time, have lower achievement, and didn't play long enough to get that kind of 2-year peak. But in each of these things, what I wanted was someone to be in this group, you had to compare with Cow Smokes and Turds, right? You had to like clearly beat them in a category or be on par with them in all categories. And if you clearly beat them in one category, you had to not be that far behind in the others. So Meta is a little left out here, but it's not a coincidence I had him bottom of this group. He has a similar peak to the above three. I think compared to Cow Smokes and Turds, he's up there with Turds at the high end of that group. But he's lower in achievement. He does have the higher win rate, and that was enough to get him into the group. But you can see, like, I was looking for players who kind of generally had this type of resume. And I missed some big names that I shouldn't have. And there are some players who came close, but I don't think quite made this group. And yeah, so how to reach tier 3. Everyone here won a tournament, so either you'd have to win a tournament too, or have a resume that is clearly better than them, such that if there was a win, you'd clearly be at the front of this group, right? If you didn't win, you have to kind of overachieve to make up for not winning a tournament. There are winners with achievements, like icon counts comparable to the Cow Smokes Turds group, but that clearly have lower peaks and lower overall win rates. And so I don't want to spoil too much people in later videos, but Metis was someone who was strongly in consideration, but the peak didn't come out as good. The overall win rate was a bit behind, and he did rack up the icons over time, but I thought just clearly wasn't quite in this group. Though I know Smoke says Metis was like his most enjoyable, most interesting rival, and that he felt they were really close to on par. But I think you look at the numbers, you look at their success, I think Smokes comes out overall as better by enough that they're in different tiers. There are also winners with higher win rates. You know, someone like Virgil did not play very long, but won one of his tournaments, had another good run. But he's just so far behind on longevity, on achievements, that he was someone I also thought was not quite there. And you also have someone like Bren. And Bren is another person who came really close to this adjustment, where he has a peak that is firmly in this group. He's behind on achievements, however. His win rate's in this group, his peak's in this group, but he has, I think, 3 icons, maybe 4 icons, and everyone in the Cow Smokes Turds group has, 7, 8 plus, right? And so he was someone where in no category is he beating this group, and in one category he's way behind. So again, very close to making this tier. Didn't quite, for me. Good for you. Any of these names, good for you, and it would be a reasonable list. So Meta made my original tier 3 because he's ahead on win rate, is on par for peak, and loses on longevity. But someone like Firebrand, who played 2 tournaments, is ahead on win rate, but far behind in the others, and was not in serious consideration for this tier. So as I said, there are other players who could be considered. They didn't quite make it for me. You have to come out with a list. But I did think there were 3 people who, by this kind of criteria, did make the list and deserve to be included, and we're going to discuss them now. How long have I been going? Only 18 minutes of preamble. For me, that might be pretty good. Who didn't quite make the cut? Yeah, so there were non-winners that were close on icons or looked similar to the players here, but they didn't win a tournament, and I think you have to look like you're ahead of the winners to be put in a group with them, just because winning a tournament is so hard and such an achievement. There are tournament winners with higher win rates than those here, but they didn't play long enough. There are tournament winners with more icons than those here, but they didn't peak as well, or they have much lower win rates overall. As I said, there were some borderline cases. I mentioned Metis, I mentioned Bren. I think those were the 2 closest. But I thought the cutoff was cleaner here, because when they start making it, then some more non-winners start looking like maybe they should make it, and I thought this was the cleanest cutoff. So it's all pretty debatable, of course. I think the top 12 I came out with, I feel very good about being the top 12. But I think after that, there's a lot of room for debate. The gaps get smaller and smaller, and separating into tiers can be difficult. So we're going to expand from this being 13 to 21st to 13 to 24th. So we had our top 12. This is the next 12. Here's where I cut it off. Here's who made this cut. So here's the original tier 3. We have 13th Cookie, 14th Vid, 15th Turds, 16th Cast Debonair, 17th Sir Smokes, 18th Dark Lord, 19th Karmazin, 20th Serenity, 21st Meta. And I felt pretty good about that order, and then I got really thrown off by the 3 I was adding. So let's get into them. So we have Broccoli, aka Emerald, originally known as Rapid Assassin when she first won the first site champion. She's a two-time site champion. She won the first site championship and the 9th. She has 4 icons and got another semifinals in them. All her best results, both her wins and her semifinals, were in TTAC. And she also came 3rd in the first closed tournament. And I think it speaks to any format that included closed, she was really good at. She got recognized for this. She came 2nd to Yojimbo in the All-Around Player of the Year vote in 2011. But I think there's a really underrated skill in closed hand making. Because most closed is played random, and open tournament games are played with hands, otherwise often played random. But there's not really, because there weren't many closed tournaments until a few that came late, what you have is closed with hands is not a skill that's very tested. And if you built a hand and played a bunch of closed with it, people would see you playing or have seen your hand before and know what cards you had, and it would be a huge disadvantage. So there wasn't a way to just normally test closed hand making. But if you look at the articles she made about hand building, she made hands that had synergies, but not necessarily pairs or predictable types of card pairings. So cards that work together but weren't obviously fitting rules that would be easily predicted. And I suspect this really helped her in tournaments like TTAC and the closed tournament, because I think she just had this real big skill for building hands that would be effective in open, but also really effective in closed. And I think her results there really bear that out. And I'm not saying that to dismiss her results, because she was also clearly a great open player. I'm saying that to say I think she had a skill that is underrated by what kind of like hard to give proper credit to, because so little of what happened on the site gave it value, assigned it worth. And the few times it did, she crushed those events. Absolutely crushed them. So she's only one of only 12 players to win multiple open tournaments. Again, TTAC, both open and closed. I'm counting it as an open tournament and a closed tournament. She won 2 tournaments in her first 6. The only player to win 2 tournaments faster is Doc Evil, who won 2 in his first 2. But she's ahead of me. I took 7 or 8. A bunch of other players took like 10, 11, 12. I think I'm in 3rd for that. But, she's faster. Only surpassed by Doc Evil in speed to win her first 2 tournaments. And also really remarkable that she won a tournament, played a few more tournaments, took like a 5-year, 6-year break, came back, and immediately wins the next tournament. And I also want to say, when she won the first site championship, she held on to the title until Kamikaze took it from her. So she held the title when Firebrand won the second site championship. I think that was Firebrand. It was Firebrand or Unfixable. One of them she beat for the second. And then she wins the 9th site championship as well. She's the only player to win multiple site championships. It's an incredible resume. She has total duration as site champion, is behind only Was Up in Kamikaze. Really, really cool run. I kind of brushed past her when first looking, but as a multiple-time tournament winner, that was really stupid of me. And her overall resume, as we'll get into, I think holds up pretty well. So how does she compare to Tier 3? She has 2 tournament wins, and that already puts her in a group with only Cookie, or if we include closed-only tournaments with Cookie and Vid, who were the 2 people at the top of Tier 3. So already she's really in the conversation with the high end of Tier 3. However, her 4 icons are behind, right? The Cow Smokes Turds group all have kind of 7+, and that's a lot more. There are people like Siphon Meta, Serenity and Meta, who are at the bottom of the group, who have icon counts around there. But what we have is an interesting case on achievement, because she's got the 2 wins, but the overall body of work aside winning seems at the bottom end of this group, but the 2 wins seems at the top end of this group. Her peak 8 tourney run is weird to calculate, because usually it's kind of a 2.5 year span, but for her, it's her first tournament, a few tournaments after that, and then a huge time skip, and then a few tournaments after that. But over the run, it puts her just right in the middle of that Cow Smokes Turds crowd for peak. And if you look at her win rates, who she beat, it looks like that Cow Smokes Turds crowd, where just weaker players do not have a chance to beat her. Other very good players she is putting up great performances against, and the players who are better usually beat her. Much like the Cow Smokes Turds group, though not always. Definitely has a chance to knock out anyone. But she's got lower achievement. So she's got similar peak, similar overall win rate, and then how do you judge the achievement when it's lower on kind of making the quarterfinals, but higher on actually winning tournaments? So I think that ends up being a little worse, but you could put it better and that would not be crazy. Like you could easily say Cookie, Vid, and Broccoli, clearly the best of this group. I'm going to end up putting her a little lower, but you could certainly put her higher than I do. It depends what you value. And that's what so much of this list comes down to of, what do you end up valuing? So then we have Diakon Entite. And Diakon Entite wins Triad Wars 9. He kind of has an interesting two-peak thing, much like Broccoli, where around TTAC 5, so that'd be kind of the 2007 period, he ends up having a run where he makes 2 different semifinals and maybe another quarterfinals in there, has a really nice, solid run, and then doesn't do anything for 3-4 years or has poor tournament results, and then wins Triad Wars 9 and has a nice run after that too. So he ends up getting to 7 icons, which is a very nice count as we keep talking about. He also wins Clan League 4 with Triforce. I think the craziest thing about him is he's 4-1 against Yojimbo, which, Yojimbo won 7 tournaments. Yojimbo is just, I think, undeniably, top 5 all time and, very hard to argue against being top 2 or 3 or top 1. And Diakon Entite has the best record of all time against Yojimbo. I think there are only 3 winners with plus records against Yojimbo, but 4-1 is clearly the best of them. And in Triad Wars in general, he has the 9th highest win rate of anyone ever, was very good at Triad Wars specifically, or had his best results there, which you'd expect given that's the one he won. How does he stack up? He really looks like Serenity, who I'm going to interchangeably call Serenity and Scythe. D has 7 icons to Scythe's 5. They're going a little less deep. Like D only has 1 finals and Scythe has 2 finals. Scythe's runs tended to be deep when he got going, and Diakon is a lot more quarterfinal finishes. But for overall achievements, my war stat gives Diakon a slight but clear edge. They have the 2nd and 3rd highest 2-year peaks in Tier 3. Only Vid is ahead of them of people we've talked about. Again, D is a tad ahead of Serenity, but, it's close. D is also ahead in win rate. Scythe ended up dropping a lot of games to weaker players and ended up around 55%. Diakon's more like 59%, which is below the Cow Smokes Turds tier, but, still a very respectable win rate. And they both have similar win types. It's very strange. They're 2 players, and I think calling them aggressive players like Delial makes sense because Delial has some of this effect too, where tremendously good win rates against the best, and not nearly as convincing win rates against weaker players than other comparable people. Like Cow Smokes and Turds, the people I keep talking about as kind of my baseline, they really, really reliably beat weaker players, and Diakon did not. But Diakon also 4-1 Yojimbo. He's 9-9 total versus other winners. He's 2-0 versus Scythe. I think in basically every category, Diakon Entite is a tiny bit to a reasonable bit ahead of Scythe. So I obviously should have included him in the last video, and I feel kind of silly that I didn't. So Diakon Entite I will rank higher than Scythe, but how much higher is up in the air? And how much higher you rank. I don't think there's any way to rank him behind Scythe, and any list, like my list last time, you should discount as silly. But how similar are they? How close do they come? Not clear. And then the third one is going to be by far the most controversial, perhaps. But Chickeny, who showed up towards the end of the site, peaks around 2011-12. So some people just won't have overlapped. Like, a lot more, I think, won't have overlapped with Chickeny. Or because he came later, this won't be someone you read about, an occult fan, or a name you heard a lot. But there are only 3 players who made multiple finals without winning one. Most famously, Kazik made 2 finals and didn't win either in fairly quick succession. But Chickeny actually made 3 finals. So Chickeny is the record for most finals without winning any. Really high TTAC win rates. If you adjust for opposition, largely because he kept drawing Yojimbo in tournaments, but also a lot of other really good players. Chickeny, by calculations I did, has the 3rd toughest tournament roads of anyone. Now, if you don't want to use win rates as your opposition adjustment, you can get different results. But I think if you look at Chickeny's paths, very tough opponents. Ended up winning 5 clan tournaments, Clan League 7, 8, 9, Clan Wars 9 and 10 with Brotherhood of Seed. Those teams were incredibly dominant, and Chickeny was a really important, active, strong part. I believe in Clan League 8, Chickeny beat me in a closed match. I wouldn't remember this, but there was an Occult Fan article as I was scanning for things to say about players that mentioned me complaining that Chickeny had beaten me with a plus at the end, where a 7 plus 1 equaled an 8 plus 2. Or, sorry, a 7 and a 1 had plussed a 2 and an 8, and I was frustrated. But, this is to say, Chickeny was a really big part of these teams, not a hanger-on, but a key component of these incredibly dominant teams. So how does Chickeny compare? And this is where it gets really difficult, because everyone else I've talked so far about is a winner. And he never won a tournament. They all did. If you take the 2-year peak performance that I keep talking about, and I think is a really useful measure of, because let's say a player had a really good peak, was a great player, and then kept playing tournaments but didn't care. Maybe Cookie's an example, maybe someone like Jadat's an example, where they were a lot more invested for a period of a couple of years, and then they kept playing, but they stopped being invested, and their win rate suffers over time. Should I punish them for having continued to play tournaments? And I think an kind of 8 tournament peak is a nice way of saying, here's a really significant amount of time, and I'm not going to punish you for not caring outside of this run. I'm going to look at how you did at your best, but make it a real durable amount of time such that it's not kind of just random. Or just saying, oh, you won a tournament, you must all be equal because you all won a tournament. Something really short might say that. So his 8 tournament or 2-year peak is higher than anyone else we're talking about in Tier 3. It's a little behind, I forget who has the highest of Koner and Kamikaze. It's a little behind one of them, basically on par with the other, and Sujiro. Just doesn't have the longevity, right? Played 16 tournaments, non-Rhinoa, which is basically the same as Sujiro, but much less than Koner and Kamikaze did. So it doesn't have the longevity of those two. But actually 3 finals is as many as Kazi made, and more than the other 2 made. So made the finals a really high rate at the time. And the overall resume looks like Sujiro's, except there's no title to cap it off, right? Sujiro wins SE Eris, including beating Karmazin on the way. Great run. I think that's the best 7-round tournament run of all time. Chickeny doesn't have something like that to cap it off, but does have a really impressive resume. And the question is, how good do you think Sujiro's resume looks if he never wins Eris, right? If he makes the finals there. Or you take Dark Lord, but you play double the time as what Dark Lord did. And this is comparable because they both played towards the end, though Dark Lord peaked a little after Chickeny peaked. You take Dark Lord, you double the amount played, but you take away his win and turn it into a finals. And double that time while maintaining the success level. So how do you rate Chickeny against people like Sujiro or Dark Lord? He's not a winner. And I think in team sports, there's the whole rings arguments, right? Like, MJ's the best because he won 6 championships. No, Bill Russell's the best because he won 11. Kobe's better than whoever because Kobe has more championships, which is nonsense. Kobe is enormously overrated. But that's all team tournaments, right? A single player can have a lot of impact in a team setting, but attributing them for the entirety of championships or anywhere near that is a ridiculous and foolish way to look at sports and evaluate them. But this is single-player competitions, and the more something is in your control, the more I think it is fair to start looking at things like just, did you win a tournament? And so Chickeny did not. But other than that, Chickeny looks like a better player or at the very top of this group. And I think that's hard to rate, and we're going to get into where I do rate it. But I think he's clearly the best non-winner. There was no other non-winner whose resume stacked up and looked like the better end of winners, just hadn't won. All the other non-winners looked like, oh, if you had won, you would be a reasonable, like the best of most other non-winners looked like, you could be in the cow smokes turds kind of tier if you had won a tournament. You didn't, so I'm going to have you behind. But Chickeny's resume looks like, oh, if you had won a tournament, you would be right there with Sujiro, which is, the end of tier 2. So yeah, where to place him. And one last thing I want to say about Chickeny is many players in this group played like 30 tournaments and won 1. And that's a 3.3% win rate, right? You know, some played 35 or 40 tournaments. You know, Cookie played like 40 tournaments and won 2. That's a 5% win rate or whatever. You know, there's lots of people. It's very rare to have a win rate above kind of 10 or 15% in tournaments over anyone who played a decent sample. So Chickeny played 16 tournaments and happened not to win one. But, you know, if he had played 30, what are the odds he would have won one? Pretty good, right? And this is like, we talked about Karmazin earlier. Karmazin played 2 tournaments. Really hard to extrapolate from that. However, Chickeny played 16 and has the best resume of any non-winner, and a resume that looks like the resume of a lot of the better winners right before they won. So what do you do with that? Like, it looks a lot like young Seto, basically, is actually an analogy I should have checked the numbers on. But I think he looks a bunch like Seto before Seto had broken through. And we saw what Seto ended up with. Possibly the best player ever. So, and Chickeny played a bit longer before breaking through than Seto. So maybe not, like, I'm not saying Chickeny is Seto. No one's Seto except Seto. But it's I don't know, it's a curious comparison. So how does this group compare to winners? I got lazy. I didn't bother to look up Chickeny's record. Broccoli's record against winners is not particularly strong. She's beaten both Koner and Cookie, which are good wins, but it was later end Cookie, so the win against Koner is by a decent amount the best win on her resume. And she tended not to get drawn that much with the top end of winners. So I think this is one of the places where her resume looks a little weaker. Obviously, one of the places it looks stronger is that she won 2 tournaments, you know. But I think this is not a strong part of her resume. Diakon Entite is 9-9 against winners, which, as we've seen, is a very good win percentage. A lot of the people in Tier 2 have records like that against winners. And notably is 4-1 versus Yojimbo and 2-0 versus Serenity. So, admittedly, that means he's 3-8 versus winners again, other than those 2. But those 2 are pretty valuable wins, and I give a lot of credit to that. So, okay, what does ELO say? We'll keep popping different ways to look at the players at you. By peak rating, Chickeny has pretty clearly the highest, and then there's a similar drop from Diakon down to Broccoli. They all achieved their peaks in the 2011 to 2014 range. I do think there's a kind of distinct era jump there sometime around 2012 to 13, where players like myself left. And if you look at the top rated list in 2011 versus 2014, it looks very, very different. So I do think this means these are not as directly comparable as you might think, but they're fairly close to the same eras. And I think thus the ratings are somewhat comparable. And if you look at peak world rank, Chickeny peaked at 2nd behind Yojimbo. Diakon peaked at 7th, but it was an era with more strong players around. And Broccoli peaked at 9th, but again, in an era with more strong players around. Overall, I think what this says is Chickeny's peak is just really high, that he was just winning a very high rate for a while. And the other 2, impressive as well. But again, the Chickeny question is so difficult. So peak 8 tournament runs. Karmazin and Dark Lord played 2 and 7 tournaments respectively. They did not reach 8 tournaments played. Dark Lord would be towards the top end of this group. Karmazin's just too far away to extrapolate. If you say he would have maintained, you know, a 92% win rate forever, then, you know, he's not only at the top of this group, he's the best player ever, Doc Evil is. I don't think such things can be extrapolated. But the players we have, you can see Chickeny at 78.5%. This is opposition adjusted. His actual win rate was more like 73, 74%, which would still be very high here. Then Vid at 77.1, Diakon Untite at 76.2, Serenity at 75.6. That's the 75 plus group. And then we have a 71 to 74 group with Turds, Cookie, Meta, Kaus, Broccoli. Ooh, I ordered Broccoli and Kaus wrong. That was bad error on my part. And then Smokes at the bottom, but, you know, very close, such that, like, if you evaluated strength of opposition slightly differently or whatever, you know, when people are a percent apart, is it that big a deal? No. So Chickeny is the highest multi-year peak, and he was ranked number 2 in the world, which only Kaus, Cookie, and Dark Lord ever did higher of people here. They were all briefly ranked number 1, Cookie with the only decent duration there. Has the highest peak rating of anyone here, had, by win percentage, the toughest opposition of anyone here, made more finals than anyone here with 3. So, I keep coming back to the Chickeny thing, but it's so hard to judge because you could just say, yeah, Chickeny's the best player. And you could say Chickeny never won. He doesn't even deserve to be listed with these other players. And I don't think either is inherently unreasonable. So, okay, let's get to my rankings. The previous rankings, you can see who used to be here, and I've added in question marks where I've inserted the 3 new players. So feel free to look at the list and think those are ridiculous places to put them, or to think, which one of them would I put 18th? Which one will he put 18th? He'll be wrong. And, do whatever you want with this. I just thought it would be fun to have a reveal. And our reveal is... Ooh, I should have done them one at a time like I did last time. Ooh, my bad. All right, my reveal is I ended up putting Broccoli 22nd. I ended up thinking that her 2 tournament wins is really good, and if you wanted to put her higher, we'll get to that in a bit, you certainly could, but that her overall body of work looked more to me at the lower end of this group, and I put her behind the really high peak guys of Dark Lord and Karmazin. And if you wanted to put her higher, that's totally reasonable. Things like her win rate against strong opposition, a bunch of things just got me. The fact that her best results came in partially closed settings and tournaments were much more open, so I'm not sure how much you can extrapolate out of that. Though the more you think tournaments should have been closed, the higher you should bump her on your list. And this is not to say she was weak at all in open. Very strong player on both, but I think had something special in closed that the site never had enough data to show, and I think that's really cool, but it also means it's not something I'm going to rank all that highly. Still, obviously 22nd all time is a hugely high spot. I'm just saying, if you want to rank her higher, go for it. She, deserves to be ranked very high. In 19th, I had Chickeny, and I was really torn on this. But Chickeny and Dark Lord were sort of contemporaries, and the thing that put Chickeny over the top for me was that he did achieve a higher peak rating while they were playing at similar times, and that he played longer. And that was enough for me to think, okay, he may not have won, but I think I'm going to put him ahead of the Dark Lord Karmazin group. But I had trouble thinking he was ahead of the large icon counts as well as having won a tournament group of Turds, Cows, and Smokes. But that's just where I put him. And then Diakon Entite, I said, I'm going to have him better than Serenity, but I don't know how much. And I kept looking at his peak and seeing his peak really is near the top of this group. But unlike Chickeny, whose peak he's a little behind, he's won a tournament. And he also has this incredible 4-1 record versus Yojimbo, and his 9-9 record versus other winners is one of the highest here. If you want to see other people's records versus winners, it was in the last video. I actually don't have it up easily accessible, which is my bad. But, he's got some of the best records against the best. I just think Diakon at his best is one of the most threatening and possibly just best players here. I'd probably go with Karmazin as I think the best overall player here. But again, doesn't have the tournaments. But Diakon kind of does have the tournaments and is clearly a really, really high-level player who plays this very dynamic style where things can go wrong and he can lose games to anyone, but he can beat anyone too. So anyways, that's where I put them. If you have different orders, that's fine. I decided actually I wanted to do a sort of adjusted version where I said, what range do I think you could be reasonably put in? So this is tournament success. This is not the same as skill talent. I didn't play long enough to see lots of these players play. I can't really judge that fairly, but I can do statistical looks and just some knowledge of my own on total tournament success. And so I think I had Cookie 13th, and I think the lowest I could have put him is 18th. I think any lower than 18th does not make sense, just based on who I thought could be argued ahead of him. And Vid 13th to 18th. Turds, I think I put at the very top end of what he could be. I don't think there's a case for him ahead of Cookie and Vid, so I think his peak is 15th, and I don't think I could have put him lower than 22nd. Cows and Smokes, who again I had a lot of trouble differentiating from Turds, same thing. All they're going to be somewhere 15th to 22nd. Diakon, I thought was in the same group. I could have put him ahead of those 3. I ended up putting him behind. You could put him a bunch lower. Not that much lower, but a bunch lower. Broccoli, I think you can get up to 14th depending on what you value, but you can also have as low as 22nd, and I ended up putting her slightly at the lower end of that range. Dark Lord you could have at the bottom of this group, but you could also have really near the top. You know, his 7 tournament run is about as good as anyone's 7 tournament runs here. A similar thing with Karmazin. If you really value that 2 tournament run, he's the top end of this group, and you might even have him higher. If you think you got to put up more data, like you got to have a larger sample, you got to play more tournaments than that to be ranked this high, then you could put him, typo. That should not say 25th. That should say 24th. There are only 24 people here, but my bad. And then Chickeny, 15th to 24th. Chickeny's peak's so impressive, you can get him real high. It's hard for me to put him above multiple 2-time tournament winners. So I thought 15th was about the highest you could go. But you could also have him at the bottom of this group. And you could have him in the next group. There are some other winners you could have ahead of Chickeny. I think Chickeny's clearly the greatest non-winner of all time. And so if you want to put non-winners high, you got to have Chickeny even higher. And if you don't care about the non-winners so much, then Chickeny can be lower. His resume is really impressive, as I keep saying, and I know I've repeated myself a lot. Serenity, I think, somewhere in the 21st to 24th range. I think his inconsistency, his years of kind of lots of first-round exits make it hard to get him that high on the list. But and then Meta, I also think, has to be towards the lower end. But I guess what I really wanted to say is you can rearrange this list lots of different ways. And as long as people are sort of in the ranges I gave them, I think it's a very reasonable list. I think there are a few things like, you know, if you put Serenity ahead of Diakon Entite, as I mistakenly did last time, you're making a mistake. I think that one pretty clearly comes out. Diakon Entite has to be ahead of Serenity. But you could have Serenity 21st and Diakon Entite 20th, and you'd have a very different list than I do, and it would be a totally reasonable list. I'd really love to see other people's lists. Slash provided his after the last one. I thought it was really interesting and very defensible, and it sort of inspired me to do these ranges of where I thought was reasonable to put people. And so then I wanted to look at the tier 2 list again. And I think Great Sephiroth is 6th. Like, if you don't have Great Sephiroth 6th, I think you're making a mistake. He's clearly the best of this group and not quite in that higher group. And then mostly I thought this group could be ordered however you wanted. Sujiro should be at the lower end. And it might look weird that, like, MC could be 7th through 12th, while Nightwish only 7th through 11th. But I think it's important that Nightwish won 2 tournaments and MC only won 1. And I think with Nightwish's second tournament win, it would be hard to put multiple players ahead of him that are currently behind him. While MC, I could imagine an argument for Sujiro over MC, for other people over MC. And similarly, Slash won 3 tournaments, which is the most here of anyone beside Great Sephiroth, who also won 3. And so I really would have trouble putting Sujiro's 1 tournament ahead of Slash when Sujiro is not, like, crushing him in other ways, which he definitely isn't. So, like, if you put, you know, Slash 7th, Koner 8th, Kamikaze 9th, Nightwish 10th, MC 11th, Sujiro 12th, you know, totally reversing my order on the middle, that would be a reasonable list too, you know, or throw Sujiro in 9th there. I think there's lots of reasonable orders of this list, and I just thought it might be fun to offer sort of my confidence intervals of what I thought was reasonable. So that's my tier 3 adjustment. I know I went on a long time. I do rather have that habit. But I hope it was interesting, and I hope the ranges are an appealing way to present it, because I spend so much time just moving people up and down the list and staring at it and thinking, that looks wrong, and then I change it, and that looks wrong too. And, well, I guess I'm an indecisive mess about this, but hopefully it was interesting, and I like having, you know, I started with a top 6, or top 5, it became a top 12, and now we've doubled that to a top 24.